You're listening to What to Listen To, the podcast that answers the question you didn't even know you were asking. From fascinating deep dives to thought-provoking trends, we've got your ears covered, so sit back, plug in, and let's explore what's worth your time today.
Welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
You know, after the response to our last two episodes on us versus them, we knew we had to keep digging.
For sure.
And wow, our listeners really piled on the source material for this one.
Yeah, they did.
It seems like the urban-rural divide in America really struck a nerve.
Absolutely.
And you've given us a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, from historical analyses to economic reports to even some personal essays.
Yeah, it's a big topic.
Huge.
And I have to admit, even I was surprised at how deep this divide runs.
Right.
I mean, it's not just about politics, is it?
No.
We're talking about different ways of life, different values, almost like two separate worlds colliding.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so...
And what's fascinating is that this isn't some recent phenomenon.
Right.
This tension between urban and rural America has been simmering since the very beginning.
Okay, so before we dive into the nitty-gritty, give us the historical Cliff's Notes. When did this us versus them mentality between cities and the countryside really start to take root?
Well, one of the sources, a historical study on rural outmigration, points to the Industrial Revolution as a major turning point.
Okay.
Cities became centers of industry, attracting waves of immigrants and workers seeking opportunity.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, rural areas remained largely tied to agriculture, creating this initial economic gap.
So right from the get-go, we had this divergence in economic paths.
Exactly.
Cities booming with factories and innovation, and rural communities holding steady with farming and tradition.
Exactly, and that economic divide only deepened over time.
Okay.
Another source, a report on federal spending, points out how New Deal programs, while intended to help everyone, often unintentionally favored urban industries.
And that probably fueled resentment in rural communities feeling left behind, right?
Absolutely. And then you have the rise of suburbs in the mid-20th century. Middle-class families fled cities, taking resources and attention with them. So now you have this three-way dynamic with rural areas feeling squeezed from both sides.
This is where it gets really interesting for me.
Yeah.
Because we often think of the urban-rural divide as a modern problem.
Right.
But it sounds like this tension has been building for generations.
It's deeply ingrained in our nation's history.
Wow.
And it's crucial to understand that context because it informs the very different perspectives we see today.
Okay, let's talk about those perspectives.
Okay.
Let's say you're sitting down with someone from a big city and someone from a small rural town.
Right.
How would they describe their realities?
Well, the sources we have, particularly a series of interviews with people from both urban and rural communities, highlight some stark contrasts.
Okay.
From the urban side, there's this emphasis on diversity, progress, opportunity. They see cities as engines of innovation and cultural change.
And they might view rural areas as being resistant to that change, maybe even a little backward.
Some of the interviewees did express that sentiment, yes. But on the flip side, you have the rural perspective. They talk about feeling left behind by globalization, struggling with job losses, and a sense that their way of life is under attack.
It's like they're looking at the same country, but seeing completely different realities.
And feeling increasingly alienated from each other.
Right.
Several sources, including a sociological study on social identity, suggest that this feeling of being misunderstood is a major factor driving the polarization we see today. And it's not just about feelings.
Right. This divide has real-world consequences.
Exactly. Think about the economic disparity.
Okay.
One of the sources, a report from the Economic Innovation Group, highlights that urban areas generate over 80% of the U.S. GDP.
Wow, 80%. That's a huge imbalance.
It is, and it translates into very different realities when it comes to things like job opportunities, access to healthcare, even the quality of education.
That report actually had a really striking statistic that stuck with me. It said that a child born in a rural community is statistically less likely to move up the economic ladder than a child born in a city.
It really highlights the lack of opportunity in many rural areas, and that economic disparity feeds into the political polarization we're seeing.
Right, it's like this vicious cycle. Rural communities feel neglected by the government, so they vote for candidates who promise to shake things up, which often leads to policies that further benefit urban areas.
And then urban voters feel like their values and priorities aren't being represented, which leads to even more division.
The 2016 election was a prime example of this, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. One of the sources of political analysis of the election argues that Trump's victory was a direct result of the deep resentment and frustration felt in many rural communities. They felt ignored by the establishment and saw Trump as someone who understood their struggles.
But it's not just about politics and economics, is it? There's a cultural element to this divide as well.
You're absolutely right. The sources we have, particularly a series of essays on rural identity, talk about the importance of tradition and faith in these communities.
Values that they often feel are threatened by the cultural shifts happening in cities.
Exactly. And those cultural differences are often amplified by the media, which tends to portray both urban and rural communities in very stereotypical ways.
So we end up with these caricatures of the latte-sipping liberal elite versus the backward gun-toting redneck, which only further widens the gap.
And makes it even harder to have a productive conversation about how to address the very real challenges facing both urban and rural America.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope of bridging this divide?
I do believe there's hope, and some of the sources offer some potential solutions. One key area is economic investment in rural communities.
Makes sense. If we want to create opportunity, we need to invest in things like infrastructure, education, and job training in these areas.
One source, a policy report on rural development, suggests focusing on expanding broadband access,
which is crucial in today's digital economy.
Absolutely, and investing in renewable energy projects that create jobs and revitalize local economies.
So it's not just about handouts, but about creating sustainable opportunities for growth and prosperity in rural areas.
Exactly. But economic solutions alone aren't enough. We also need to address the cultural and social factors that contribute to this divide.
One source, a study on intergroup dialogue, found that simply bringing people from urban and rural communities together to share their stories and perspectives can have a powerful impact on reducing prejudice and fostering understanding.
It's about humanizing the other and recognizing our shared humanity.
And maybe even finding common ground on issues where we might not agree.
Exactly. And then there's the role of education.
You know, one of the sources in the article on rural education pointed out how important it is to expose rural students to a wider range of perspectives and opportunities.
And to connect them with mentors and resources that can help them succeed, whether they choose to stay in their communities or pursue opportunities elsewhere.
It's about empowering them to make informed choices about their futures.
And on the urban side, it's about educating city dwellers about the challenges and contributions of rural communities.
So we can break down those stereotypes and build a more nuanced understanding of each other's realities.
It's a two-way street, and it requires effort from both sides.
It sounds like there's no quick fix here. It's about addressing this divide on multiple fronts: economic, social, cultural, and political.
And it's about recognizing that this isn't just a rural problem or an urban problem, it's an American problem.
Because at the end of the day, we're all interconnected.
Our fates are intertwined, and building a stronger, more unified nation requires bridging this divide.
It's amazing how much we've covered in this deep dive.
I know, right?
And honestly, it's a bit overwhelming to think about the scale of this divide.
It's huge.
Where do we even begin to tackle something this complex?
It is a daunting challenge, but I think one of the most important takeaways from all of these sources is the need for empathy. Really trying to understand the perspectives and experiences of people who live in different realities than our own.
That resonates with me.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in our own bubbles and make assumptions about people we don't know.
Exactly. And one source, a study on political polarization, pointed out how social media often exacerbates this problem.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We tend to surround ourselves with information that confirms our existing biases, making it harder to engage with different viewpoints.
So step one is breaking out of those echo chambers.
Yeah.
And actively seeking out diverse perspectives.
Absolutely.
But what comes after that?
That's the question.
How do we translate that empathy into action?
Well, several sources highlight the importance of finding common ground, focusing on the issues that unite us rather than the ones that divide us.
You know, one of the sources, a report on rural-urban partnerships.
Yeah.
A great example of this, talking about a community project, where a group of farmers partnered with an urban food bank to provide fresh produce to low-income families in the city.
That's a perfect example of how collaboration can not only address practical needs, but also build bridges between communities.
It's like when we work together towards a shared goal,
Yeah.
We start to see each other as partners, not adversaries.
Exactly.
But let's be realistic. There are some deep-seated differences in values and beliefs.
For sure.
How do we bridge that gap?
One source and an essay by a sociologist argued that we need to move beyond simple tolerance and strive for genuine understanding.
Okay.
It's not about agreeing with everything someone believes, but respecting their right to hold those beliefs and engaging in open and honest dialogue.
That's a powerful idea.
It is.
It's about recognizing that we can disagree on certain issues while still finding common ground on others and working together to build a better future.
Mm-hmm.
But let's be honest, this isn't something that's going to change overnight.
No, it's going to take time.
It's a long-term process.
For sure.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
And I hope it's done the same for our listeners.
I hope so.
The urban-rural divide is a complex issue.
It is.
But it's not insurmountable.
No.
It's a challenge that demands our attention, our empathy, and our willingness to work together to build a more unified nation.
Well said. And remember, this conversation doesn't end here.
Yeah.
Keep exploring these issues, keep challenging your own assumptions, and keep reaching out to those who see the world differently than you do.
Thank you for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time, ready to explore another fascinating corner of the world.
Until next time, don't just hear the world, listen to it.